68 years old, zero debt, $2,200 a month. And somehow, this man is happier with his money than almost anyone you know, making 5 times that. What if the number everyone's chasing for retirement is completely wrong? What if the whole, you need $2 million saved up thing that every finance guru screams at you is actually just noise? Picture this. You're sitting across from a 68-year-old man in a small kitchen. No mortgage payment, no car loan, no credit card statement waiting to ruin his morning coffee. He gets $2,200 deposited into his account every single month. And he tells you calmly, "I've never felt richer in my life." And you sit there thinking, that doesn't make sense. That's less than what a lot of people spend on rent alone. How is that rich? Here's the thing though, for years, we've been sold this idea that retirement is a number. A finish line, hit 7 figures or you've failed. Buy the bigger house, upgrade the car every 3 years, keep score against your neighbors. And people spend their entire working lives chasing a bigger paycheck while their debt grows right alongside it. More income, more debt, more stress. Same hamster wheel, just a nicer looking cage. But here's what I've realized after actually digging into stories like this one. The number isn't the goal. The freedom is the goal. And freedom doesn't come from how much you make. It comes from how little you owe. Wait, really? Yeah, really. This guy isn't rich because of what's coming in. He's rich because almost nothing is going out. My name is Ozzy, and I spend way too much time analyzing why some people feel financially free on modest incomes, while others feel broke making 6 figures. If you want to understand the real mechanics behind actual financial peace, instead of hoping a bigger salary magically fixes everything, make sure you hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if it ends up shifting how you see retirement. Because right now, in 2026, more people are retiring with debt than at almost any point in recorded history. Credit, cards, car payments, even mortgages stretching into their 70s. Meanwhile, this man did the opposite of everything they told him to do, and it worked. Every dollar in your financial life falls into one of 2 categories: dollars that own you and dollars you own outright. Most people spend 40 years never realizing the difference. So how exactly did a man on $2,200 a month escape the debt trap that's swallowing people making triple that? What did he do differently in his 30s and 40s that set this up? And more importantly, could you actually do this too, starting today, no matter what your income looks like right now? Let's get into it. Let's talk about something that sounds boring, but is actually the single biggest reason this man sleeps peacefully at 68, while people making 4 times his income lie awake doing math in their heads. It's not a stock pick. It's not a side hustle. It's not some secret account nobody's heard of. It's a series of decisions, small, almost invisible decisions, made over roughly 40 years, that all point in the same direction: fewer things owning him. Here's the thing though. Every single item on this list is something almost anyone can start doing today, regardless of what their bank account looks like right now. What unifies all of these is an income. It's not luck. It's not some inheritance nobody's mentioning. It's a mindset around debt that most Americans, honestly, have been trained out of. So let's break down exactly what this man did differently, one piece at a time. Let's talk about something that sounds responsible, but is actually one of the most financially destructive habits in America: treating a car payment as a permanent fixture of life. Most people don't even think of it as debt anymore. It's just a bill, like electricity. So what we're really talking about is an average monthly car payment north of $700 every single month for most of your adult life, because as soon as one loan ends, another new car and another payment shows up to replace it. We're talking about $700 a month, every month, for roughly 40 working years. Over a lifetime, if that money had been invested instead at even a modest 7% return, that equals well over $2.3 million by retirement. Let that sit for a second. Here's what's really happening psychologically. People don't buy cars to get from point A to point B. They buy status. They buy the feeling of making it. The mental gymnastics sound like, "I deserve this," or "I work hard, I should enjoy it." But here's the math. If you drive a paid-off, reliable used car for 10 years instead of financing a new one every 4, and invest the difference, you're not just avoiding a payment, you're building the exact account that funds a debt-free retirement. Compare that to our 68-year-old, who told us flat out he hasn't made a car payment in over 20 years. He buys reliable, used, and pays cash. So you've got millions of Americans making payments on depreciating metal boxes, while a man on $2,200 a month owns his outright. That's not a coincidence. That's a choice, repeated for decades. Moving on to something that hits almost everyone, and this one's even bigger. Let's talk about the mortgage, specifically, the 30-year mortgage that never seems to actually end. This is something almost everyone does, refinancing every few years, pulling equity out for renovations or vacations, and effectively resetting the clock back to 30 years again and again. So what we're really talking about is a debt that's designed, structurally, to follow you into retirement. We're talking about a $300,000 mortgage at 7% interest paid over 30 years, costing you roughly $718,000 total once interest is factored in. That's $418, zeros and dollars in interest alone. Money that produces zero equity, zero return, nothing but a bank's profit margin. The psychological trap here is subtle. People think the payment is manageable, so it's fine. But manageable and free are two completely different categories. Here's what our retiree did instead. He made extra principal payments whenever possible, avoided refinancing for cash-out purposes, even when it was tempting, and had his house completely paid off by age 58. 10 years of zero mortgage payment before retirement even started. Let's do the math on what that meant. If his mortgage payment had been $5,800 a month, and he redirected that into an investment account for just those final 10 working years, at 7% growth, that's roughly $310,000 extra sitting there. Compare that to someone still paying a mortgage, well into their 70s, watching 2/3 of a fixed income disappear into a bank account that isn't even theirs yet. So you've got one group still renting from the bank at 70 years old, and another group who decided, decades earlier, that the goal wasn't a bigger house, it was an owned house. Here's the scary part most people don't realize. Your home is not an asset until the mortgage is gone. Until then, it's a liability with really good marketing. Here's something that destroys people financially, without them even realizing it's happening. Lifestyle inflation. Every time income goes up, spending quietly rises right alongside it, and the gap between what you earn and what you keep never actually widens. So what we're really talking about is someone who gets a raise, and instead of investing the difference, upgrades the car, upgrades the house, upgrades the vacations, and ends up in the exact same financial position as before, just with a bigger number on the paycheck stub. We're talking about, conservatively, $500 a month in upgraded spending that creeps in with every raise over a 20-year career. Over that same 20 years, invested instead at 7%. That's over $260,000. The psychology here is identity-based, not math-based. People aren't bad at math. They're responding to a feeling, I've earned this, I should live like it. Here's what's really happening. Your brain treats a raise as permission to spend, not as an opportunity to build freedom. Our retiree did the opposite. Every raise, every bit of extra income across 4 decades, largely went toward paying down debt faster or increasing savings, not toward a bigger lifestyle. Compare that to someone who's making $90,000 a year and feels broke, versus someone making $45,000 a year who feels completely secure. The difference isn't the income. It's the gap between income and spending, and whether that gap is actually being protected or quietly eaten alive. So you've got people earning more every single year and somehow feeling more financially stressed with each raise. That's the irony nobody talks about at the office holiday party. Let's talk about something that sounds harmless, but keeps millions of retirees working past the age they wanted to stop. Carrying a credit card balance as just how it is. This is something almost everyone does, treating minimum payments as normal, not realizing what that minimum payment is actually costing. So what we're really talking about is a $6,000 average credit card balance at 24% interest, which, if only minimum payments are made, can take over 15 years to pay off and cost more than $9,000 in interest alone on a $6,000 purchase. We're talking about paying 1.5 times the original amount just for the privilege of not addressing it sooner. The psychological trap is avoidance. People don't look at the statement because looking at it feels bad, so the balance just sits there, quietly compounding against them instead of for them. Here's the math nobody shows you. That same $9,000 in wasted interest, invested instead over 15 years at 7%, becomes roughly $24,000. So the true cost of that unpaid $6,000 balance isn't $9,000. It's closer to $33,000, once you account for what that money could have become. Our 68-year-old told us directly, no credit card debt, ever, for over 30 years. Not because he never used credit cards, he used them constantly, for the points, for the convenience, but because the balance got paid in full, every single month, without exception. That's the difference between a tool and a trap. Same piece of plastic, completely different outcome depending on one habit. Here's what's really happening for most people approaching retirement, and it's rarely talked about honestly. They've built their entire plan around income replacement instead of expense elimination. So what we're really talking about is someone assuming they need 70–80% of their working income to retire comfortably, without ever asking the more important question, 80% of what? If your expenses are bloated with debt payments, that number balloons. If your expenses are lean because the debt is gone, that number shrinks dramatically. We're talking about the difference between needing $5,000 a month in retirement versus needing $200 a month. And that difference is almost entirely explained by what debts are still attached to your name the day you stop working. Let's do the math. Someone needing $5,000 a month for a 25-year retirement needs roughly $1.5 million saved, assuming a conservative 4% withdrawal rate. Someone needing $2,200 a month needs closer to $660,000. That's a swing of over $800,000 in required savings, and it has nothing to do with income and everything to do with debt elimination before the paycheck stops. Compare that to the conventional advice screaming, you need $2 million to retire, without ever asking what that person's actual monthly obligations look like. So you've got people terrified of retirement, convinced they're decades behind, when the real gap isn't their savings account, it's the debt still attached to their name. Here's what's really happening with our 68-year-old that ties every single one of these pieces together. He wasn't optimizing for a big number. He was optimizing for a small number of obligations. Social Security alone, for the average retiree, pays out around $900 to $1,200 a month depending on work history. For someone still carrying a mortgage, a car payment, and credit card debt, that check disappears in about 11 days. For someone with zero debt, that same check covers the entire month, with room left over. So the real transformation here isn't about earning more. It's about needing less, structurally, permanently, by the time that Social Security check becomes the primary source of income. That's not luck. That's not a lower cost of living state, though that helps. That's 40 years of decisions that all pointed the same direction. Own things outright, avoid revolving debt, and let time do the rest. But here's where things get really crazy, because the math on what this actually compounds into over an entire lifetime is going to completely change how you think about your own numbers. And there's one more piece to this puzzle that almost nobody accounts for when they picture their own retirement. Here's where things get interesting, because the piece almost nobody accounts for when picturing their own retirement isn't a number at all. It's a decision about where to live, made years before retirement even starts, and it multiplies every single one of the habits we just walked through. Let's talk about geographic arbitrage, because it sounds like some complicated investing term, but it's actually the simplest concept in this entire video. This is something almost nobody plans for intentionally, They just retire wherever they already happen to be living, without ever asking if that location is working for or against them. So what we're really talking about is choosing to live somewhere your fixed income actually stretches, instead of somewhere it barely survives. We're talking about property taxes that can range from $800 a year in one state to over $9,000 a year in another for a similar-sized home. Over a 25-year retirement, that difference alone is more than $200,000. The psychological trap here is sentimentality. People stay in expensive areas because this is where I raised my kids or this is home, without running the actual numbers on what that sentiment costs every single month. Our retiree made a deliberate choice decades ago to settle in a lower cost of living area, specifically because he understood that a fixed income needs a flexible cost structure to survive comfortably. Compare that to someone retiring on the same $2,200 a month in a high cost of living area, where rent alone can eat the entire check before groceries even enter the conversation. So you've got two people with identical Social Security benefits, living completely different financial realities, and the only variable is zip code. That's not something a bigger 401k fixes. That's a decision, made early, that either amplifies or destroys every other good habit on this list. But wait, it gets deeper than just location, because there's a second layer almost nobody talks about, and it's healthcare costs specifically. Here's something that destroys retirement plans without people realizing it's happening until it's too late. Most people budget for retirement based on their current expenses, completely forgetting that healthcare costs tend to rise sharply with age, right at the exact moment income becomes fixed. So what we're really talking about is a retiree in their late 60s potentially facing $6,000 to $7,000 a year in out-of-pocket medical costs, even with Medicare coverage, once premiums, supplements, and prescriptions are factored in. We're talking about nearly $175,000 over a 25-year retirement just for healthcare, layered on top of everything else. The psychological trap is denial. People in their 40s and 50s assume future. Then we'll figure it out so they don't plan for it now. Here's what our 68-year-old did differently. He stayed active specifically to reduce future medical costs, treating exercise not as vanity, but as a financial strategy. And he researched Medicare supplement options years before he actually needed them, rather than scrambling at 65. Compare that to someone who ignores their health for decades and then gets blindsided by costs that eat directly into that $2,200 check. The math is brutal here. Every dollar spent on preventable health issues later is a dollar that can't go toward groceries, utilities, or simply enjoying retirement. So you've got two people approaching the same age, same income, but one built a body that costs less to maintain, and the other is paying a second mortgage's worth of money to a healthcare system every single year. That's when everything changes. Because once you strip away debt, relocate strategically, and protect your health, something interesting happens to how Social Security actually functions in your life. Let's talk about the timing decision that almost nobody makes correctly: when to actually start collecting that check. This is something almost everyone gets wrong, either out of impatience or fear that the system will collapse before they get their share. So what we're really talking about is the difference between claiming at 62 versus waiting until 67 or even 70, where each year of delay past your full retirement age adds roughly 8% to your monthly benefit permanently for life. We're talking about a benefit that could be $1,500 a month at 62 versus $200 a month at full retirement age versus over $2,700 a month at 70. Over a 25-year retirement, that's a swing of literally hundreds of thousands of dollars in lifetime income, just based on one decision. The psychology here is fear-based. People grab the money as soon as it's available because they don't trust it'll be there later, even when the math says waiting is almost always better for anyone with a reasonable life expectancy and other means to bridge the gap. Our retiree waited until his full retirement age, specifically because his debt-free lifestyle meant he didn't need the Muncie. At 62, he could afford patience because he'd already removed the obligations that would have forced an early, smaller claim. Compare that to someone drowning in car payments and credit card minimums at 62, forced to claim early out of necessity, locking in a permanently reduced check for the rest of their life. So you're really looking at two versions of the same system. One where debt forces your hand, and one where debt elimination buys you the freedom to wait for the better number. Most people stop analyzing here. But let's go deeper, because there's a psychological shift required to actually live this way, and it's the part conventional financial advice almost never addresses. Living debt-free on a modest fixed income requires an identity shift, not just a spreadsheet. You're not just avoiding debt, you're becoming someone who measures wealth by obligations removed rather than dollars accumulated. This is a completely different scoreboard than the one most of society is playing by. Here's what's really happening in the mind of someone who's built this kind of life. They've stopped comparing their bank balance to their neighbor's new truck and started comparing their monthly obligations to zero. That's the real identity shift. From how much can I acquire to how little do I actually owe. Your future self is either going to inherit a pile of obligations or a pile of freedom, and that outcome is being decided by the decisions you're making with your money this month, not the ones you'll make right before retirement. People resist this shift because our entire culture, every advertisement, every social feed is engineered to make debt-funded consumption feel normal, even aspirational. The house that's too big, the car that's too new, the vacation that's financed on a card you're still paying off 18 months later. Our retirees simply opted out of that game decades ago, and the result is a man who, on paper, looks modest, but who described his own life as feeling, quote, richer than anyone I know. Here's the scary part. Most people don't realize until it's too late. The years between now and retirement are the only years where this kind of transformation is actually possible. Debt paid off at 58 instead of 68 means 10 extra years of compounding, 10 extra years of a health-conscious lifestyle, 10 extra years of avoiding the interest traps we walked through earlier. Every year this identity shift is delayed is a year that compounds against you instead of for you. The math doesn't wait for you to feel ready. So here's what we've really established. It was never about the size of the paycheck. It was never about hitting some magic number that finance influencers scream at you from a rented Lamborghini. It's about the gap between what comes in and what's already spoken for by debt, and closing that gap decades before the last paycheck ever arrives. A man on $2,200 a month, zero debt at 68 years old, isn't a story about scraping by. It's a story about what happens when someone spends 40 years quietly refusing every single form of revolving, compounding, life-consuming debt, one decision at a time. The car, the mortgage, the credit card, the lifestyle creep, all of it. Your first step isn't complicated and it isn't 10 years away. It's this week. Pull up every single debt you currently carry, every card, every loan, every payment, and write down the actual interest rate next to each one. Most people have never done this simple exercise, and it's the single fastest way to see exactly which debts are quietly stealing your future. Then pick the smallest balance or the highest interest rate, and put every extra dollar you can find this month toward it, while paying minimums on everything else. Your future self is counting on the decision you make right now. Trust me, they'll thank you for it. The same way our 68-year-old thanks a version of himself from decades ago that he probably doesn't even remember making these choices consciously. Here's what most people get wrong. They think freedom is something you buy. It's actually something you subtract your way toward, one debt at a time, until the day comes when a modest check in the mail feels like more than enough, because almost nothing is standing between you and keeping it. Because at the end of the day, it was never about how much money touched his hands. It was about how much of it was actually his to keep.